So what makes you and not your opponents here best suited to run against Vicki Goodwin in March?
Sure. So first of all, I think I'm running for the people of District 47 more than I'm running against Vicki Goodwin, and I really believe that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this race. I'm a native Austinite, born and raised, lived here my whole life, know the area inside and out. Grew up playing on Lake Travis, grew up playing around in Steiner, and the Steiner brothers still own the ranch out there. So I have a lot of depth in history, and my name's Jenny Roan Forgey for anybody listening at home. And then also, I have a varied background that's crucial when you go work at the state legislature. I'm an attorney. I represent small business owners and individuals before the state, practicing administrative law. So I understand agencies and how they work and how they regulate and how we need to help people when they're dealing with large, confusing bureaucracies. Also, I have a small business background. I have owned and operated 3 small businesses here in Austin, and I understand firsthand how challenging that can be and how the decisions that are made at the Capitol when it comes to regulation or taxation actually have a very real effect on families and daily lives here in Austin. I'm also a mom in the district, so I am completely living education woes and transportation and traffic woes and property tax woes. My husband and I don't mind sharing that we have owned several houses in Austin, and when I left to go to Baylor, our family moved to go to Baylor Law recently, we sold our home thinking that was a great idea because of the economy here. We came back and we cannot currently afford to buy a house in the district. That is not acceptable to me as a native who loves this town and who believes in the value of home ownership. So these are all experiences that I bring to the table. I also am a former congressional staffer. I have experience on campaigns, and I'm the only person in the race, including the incumbent, who's ever lived through redistricting. I worked on the 2001 redistricting cycle. I know what's coming. I believe in fair representation. I don't think having 6 representatives, all of the same party, is fair. I think we need to make sure that Republicans are represented as well in Travis County. So I hope to be involved in that process in greater detail in 2021.
Okay. I'm Don Zimmerman, a 5th-generation Texan. On my mom's side, my mom is a member of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, born and raised in San Antonio. My Republican roots go back to probably 1958. My mom was a precinct chair for the Republican Party in Bexar County in 1958. My parents were deeply involved politically. They were involved in the 1964 Berry Goldwater election. My family drove around southeast San Antonio with a sign on the top of our car, this blonde-haired guy with black rimmed glasses. That would be Berry Goldwater in Lyndon Johnson territory, in the heart of Democrat territory. So, yeah, I started out young as a Republican, and I've never changed on that. Texas A&M, a couple of engineering degrees. I like to joke with my colleagues that having 2 mechanical engineering degrees makes you certifiably half as smart as the average Aggie. I've worked very hard in high tech for a number of decades. I moved to Austin in 2000 and lived in the same house since 2000 in Northwest Austin and Canyon Creek. And of course in 2002, I got involved by running for office to be president of my utility district. I also endorsed 2 other fiscal conservatives who ran with me, and we ran as a slate of candidates in 2002. And I promised to the voters, after a thorough study, that if elected, I would file suit against the city of Austin for illegal taxation. I won that with 87% of the vote. The other 2 people that I endorsed, thankfully, also won by very narrow margins. And we did file suit, and as you probably know, it took 7 years to grind that lawsuit through the courts, but we eventually won and saved about $18 million for the Canyon Creek neighborhood. So I guess what I bring, of course, is experience from the Austin City Council, a great deal of experience, a lot of stuff I learned behind closed doors. I am the only elected council member who has ever studied the contract for the wood chip burning plant in Northeast Texas. I actually have toured the plant myself. I used to work on plants like this as an engineer. I did process controls, safety systems for cogeneration facilities and various processing plants, some offshore work for oil production. So I'm very familiar with how these plants are, how they're run and how they're operated. I have to be alarmed at the fact that we had a majority of elected Austin council members who voted for an absolutely horrendous, terrible utility contract without ever having read the contract. Now, for my part, when I got elected, the Austin Energy bureaucracy stonewalled me for a couple of weeks and refused to give me a copy of this contract. I had to tell them, you're going to give me the contract or I'm going to litigate the matter. And that's the only way I was able to get my hands on the contract. Now, to me, it is ridiculous that an elected official would have to basically threaten bureaucracy to hand over a document that I'm entitled to inspect and review. So I dropped my hat. I will mention one final thing. You know, we have 5 excellent candidates here, but I'm the only one who actually has a hat to throw into the ring. So I'll cede my time to my colleagues.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm Aaron Reitz, and just given the sort of weight in this room, it tells me that you guys are taking this race very seriously, and I appreciate that. This is an absolutely critical race. I'll just say very quickly to Don's hat comment that while I don't wear a hat, some of us are very proud of our hairstyles and don't like to hide them under a fedora. So in order to answer the question, why am I more qualified than Vickie Goodwin, I think it requires just a brief background about this western and southwestern Travis County district. From 1992 all the way up until 2018, with just a few exceptions during the Bush presidency, this was a reliably Republican district. And then in 2018, a sort of confluence of factors, chief among them being the Beto wave, allowed folks like Vickie Goodwin to ride into office. Now, you'll recall Vickie Goodwin in 2017, 2018 ran as a moderate. In fact, she got into trouble because of her previous associations with Republicans. This is what allowed her to be palatable to a decidedly right-of-center district and win the election against Paul Workman. But she ran a bait-and-switch campaign. And once she got into the legislature, legislated as a far-left liberal. Now, you might say, well, that's fine. I'm a far-left liberal myself. Okay. But one thing is certain. Her legislative agenda and her voting record puts her far out of step with where this district is, not just historically, but even when you dig down into some of the data and the voting habits, as late as 2018 puts her far out of step. I'll give you just one example. In 2018, HD 47 was one of 12 Republican seats that the Republicans lost in the state legislature. Of those 12, 5 of them voted for Democratic state reps, but Republican statewides. Okay, so they split their ticket. Of those 5, HD 47 voted for the highest number of Republican statewides by the widest margins. So even as late as 2018, even though they chose Goodwin over Workman, the district is still a right-of-center district. And Goodwin goes, the district gave her an inch, and she took a mile. And we can get into her voting record, I hope we do at some point, but it'll suffice for now for me to say that she is way out of step with the district. And that's exactly why you find several of us running, because we believe that she is grossly misrepresenting the district. She's not a bad person. She's a nice lady. But she does not represent the values of this district. I would argue that I do. I think that I am a conservative Republican. I stand for low taxes, especially low property taxes. I stand for light regulations and licensing burdens. I stand for life. I'm a pro-life candidate. I stand for the Second Amendment. I stand for efficiencies in government. And these are all things that Vickie Goodwin fought against during her 5 or 6 months in the legislature in 2019. So the district, in order to be adequately represented, in order for the people of HD 47 to have a real voice in state government, I think that they need a conservative Republican voice. And I'll also say this. I think that going beyond just our district, our state stands at a critical political juncture right now. The Democrats are funded, staffed, and organized in a desperate bid to flip the House blue, and in particular, flip the composition of the Texas legislature, at least the House, to a majority Democrat. The time for Republican half measures or beating around the bush or going along to get along, it's over. We are a year away from redistricting, and conservatives need to be able to look to someone to carry us through redistricting, advance a bold conservative suite of legislation, and help carry the conservative Republican banner through to the next generation so that our state can stay the land of opportunity and flourishing and family values that it always has been. And that's where I try to stand in. I'd like to be the one to help serve the people of HC 47, represent their voice in the legislature, and help keep Texas, Texas.
Hey, good afternoon, y'all. How are y'all doing today? Good. My name's Justin Berry. To answer your question, what separates me from Vicki Goodwin and what makes me more, I feel like in a better position to win in the general against her is I believe it's my experience as a police officer. I've been a police officer for 12 years now. As a public servant, I've had to go out there into the community, and regardless of any political affiliations, ideologies, any check boxes or any things like that, and go out there and solve people's problems. That's why they call police to show up. I have a problem, solve it for me. I have that experience in these 12 years of finding those solutions to people's problems. Unfortunately, a lot of the solutions that we can provide at our level are usually just temporary solutions. And what people are really asking for is more of a long-term solution to the crime that I'm having in my community, to the barking dog next door to me, to the traffic congestion. We get calls all the time about the traffic congestion. I can't move my car out of here because I'm stuck in traffic, and I get an officer over here to direct traffic out of here. All those things that you may not think of, we deal with in a law enforcement capacity. It is that experience that I believe makes me more relatable and approachable to the everyday person that comes out into our community looking for solutions to their problems. So with that, I bring a philosophy of governance to this race that I want to bring back statesmanship, where, like the y'all's name moniker, that focuses more on people's day-to-day issues. How do I be a representative person for everybody within my district? How do I find a way to solve their problems and focus on their issues? People care more about how do I get to work in under an hour nowadays than they do on most other issues. People care about feeling safe in their community, especially now in this current week of we've had how many murders so far in this first few weeks, stabbings and shootings and violent crime taking place, which we've been forecasting for years was going to come. I've been one of the vice presidents of the Austin Police Association. We've been advocating for years this will come if we don't address it now. It's that experience of knowing what's about to come and being proactive on situations rather than being in a moment of a crisis and trying to find a way to solve that problem. I'd rather be proactive in the community, know what's about to come, work with the stakeholders and the vested interest, and find those real solutions that provide so we don't have to have people become another victim of crime again. We don't have to have another gridlocked roadway system. So those are the things that I believe is going to set me up for success come November against Vikki Goodwin, is my ability to relate with the people and focus on those day-to-day issues that really impact everyone out here in District 47.
Hi everybody, my name is Jennifer Fleck. Your question is, why do I think I'm best suited to win against Vikki Goodwin? And my answer is that I think she's out of touch with this district. I've been in meetings with her where I've asked her pointed questions about, for example, the AISD curriculum that was recently adopted in the school that promotes graphic sex ed and gender fluidity. And her response to my question was that she heard, but had not taken the time to view it, she heard that it was age appropriate. This is a big issue in this city right now, this curriculum that's been adopted, and it's insulting that the representative for my district isn't informed, and I think that needs to be exposed, that she's not informed and that she appears not to care enough to get informed. I think that it's going to take a female to beat her statistically. And I actually, from the outside, look the most like her. We are probably, I don't know how old she is, but I'm guessing based on her children's ages that we are approximately the same age. We both have grown children, and we're both professionals in the district. So I think that I think I'm very similar to her demographically, but I'm on the opposite side of the political spectrum from her. I am a fiscal conservative, and I am a social conservative. I have owned a home in the district since 2005. I am a member of Austin Ridge Bible Church, and I teach middle school girls every week for the past 3.5 years. I'm very much entrenched in this community. I'm very well known. I've been members of social clubs in this community. I know a lot of people. My youngest is a freshman at Lake Travis High School. I'm very, very interconnected with all the families in Lake Travis. I think that helps me a ton. If you look at the voting in the district, a bulk, if not most of the voters are in the Lake Travis ISD school district in HD 47. I also, unlike my opponents who are also attorneys, they've been attorneys for 1 or 2 or 3 years. I've been an attorney for 20 years. I know the law very well. I know how it's written. I know how the intent of the law impacts business owners and families, and I know how it needs to change in some cases. In 2019, I wrote 3 bills that were all pro-family, pro-children, pro-parental rights as an activist, and all of those bills got filed. I'm very familiar with the legislative process. I know how to lobby a bill through the process and all the hurdles that are included in that process. And so I have real, not puffery experience, but real legislative experience, real legal experience, and real experience in the district because I serve and I live and I interact with the district. I think that's why I'm best suited to beat Vicki Goodwin in this race.
Okay, and you get to go next.
Oh, good.
What do you consider the single most important issue the legislature should pass when they meet again next year?
Just to give you guys an idea on timing wise,
Yeah.
you're actually all doing pretty good. 2 to 3 minutes, trying to stay right in that range. I know it's a little difficult.
Single issue, that's tough. I would say across the board, no matter if it's a fiscal bill or a social bill, if we can improve transparency to taxpayers and parents and voters, and we can remove conflicts of interest to taxpayers, parents, and voters, if we can do those 2 things in the family code, in the budget, in the education code, across the board, if we can do those 2 things, I think we can improve visibility, improve strengthen trust, and cut expenses, and make it so that the parents and families and taxpayers all believe in their government. I am running because I stopped believing that anybody was representing me fairly and justly. And so that's a hard question to answer in 2 or 3 minutes, but I would say increase transparency and remove conflict of interest across the board.
Okay.
So for me, the most important issue that I believe the session is going to address this next time is going to be public safety. If you look at what the governor's been talking about, the issues he's been getting involved in here in this off session, it's been things dealing with mass violence. He has his committee dealing with that right now. We just he just awarded a gentleman for stopping the church shooter that took place. And then also our homeless issue that's going on that's causing some crime issues within our communities. And not just in Austin, but around the state. So I believe that public safety is going to be a priority this next session, which makes me the most suitable to be in this seat when that time comes up from the experience that I have. And you look at this homelessness crisis that's taking place in our state, it's causing great concern because it's going to require, it's been a big burden on our taxpayers, and it's been causing a lot of inefficient uses of our tax dollars, even here at the local level, when you're looking at funding millions and millions of dollars towards, hotel renovations and buying out hotels. Well, they can only serve a finite number of people, and we want to provide permanent housing for a finite number of people. Well, we're going to have more people that need housing. So we need to look at different solutions and even possibly looking at maybe refunding the state school system that we had back in the 90s for those who want to go that are severely mentally ill and incompetent that don't have a place or the means to really provide and care for themselves due to their mental illness. Let's look at having their legal guardians give them the option of being into the state school system again where they can have access to their medication, being safe, not on the streets getting victimized. So I do believe public safety is going to be a priority. Our schools are still vulnerable. We have a lot of debates that are still taking place about what do we do, how do we keep our children safe in schools with school shootings taking place. So I do believe that that's going to be a big issue this next session, and I'll be honored to be a part of that process to ensure our communities are safe.
So I'll answer the question in two ways. One, I would say the most morally significant issue in any legislative session is the pro-life issue. That will always be the most morally significant issue that deserves the right level of attention. I would say secondarily, though, that the most important issue that is on everyone's mind that I talk to in their front doors or on the phone or in clubs is reining in out of control political subdivisions in this state that threaten to take Texas down the California path. Now, I published an op-ed actually in the Austin American-Statesman on or around November 15th in response to Vikki Goodwin's op-ed. And in that I lay out in greater detail, which I don't have the time for here, my general thesis on what's happening in Texas right now. And that's this. Just like in California 30 some odd years ago, California didn't turn into the dysfunctional state that it is today because of what happened in Sacramento. California turned into what it is today because of what started happening in the big cities. And as Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and other towns in their orbit started to grow in population, and those political subdivisions were increasingly captured by an ideological left, they dragged the state down. And now Texas is the recipient of many California expat refugees. But a lot of those same dynamics are happening as we speak in Texas. So all of my legislative priorities, for the most part, fall under this umbrella of checking and balancing large political subdivisions in this state, whether it's on the life issue, whether it's on tax spending, property tax increases, taxpayer-funded lobbying, the homeless issue, which I've committed from the beginning, and I'm the only one here at this table who has so committed, that on day one of the legislative session, I will make good on Governor Abbott's commitment to file a preemption bill banning statewide San Francisco-style homeless ordinances. So there are other issues, of course, that I'm running on, but the theme of my campaign, which resonates with the voters in HD 47, and I think resonates with Texans generally, is don't California my Texas. And the way that we do that is by building in legislative checks and balances to our cities.
I would add to what Aaron's already said, and he's a very confident and competent individual. He's absolutely right in everything he said. If he'd had the experience that I've had behind the closed doors of Austin City Council in an executive session, he would know that he's 10 times more right than he thinks. He's absolutely correct.
I'll take that as your endorsement, Don.
I'm going to go back and say
recorded.
I endorse your views on the source of the problem.
Brother.
Yeah, you understand, and you're right about that. I want to commend you for understanding that. I'm going to go back to the Texas Republican Party website, which I printed a copy off. You could find that here at Texas GOP. 5 legislative priorities that, of course, I would commit to as the Republican nominee. Constitutional carry. Pass constitutional carry while maintaining licensing as an optional for reciprocity with other states. End taxpayer-funded lobbying. That's probably the most important priority for me going in immediately from this list. The pro-life issue, pass legislation to abolish abortion. I support that. Property taxes, abolish the maintenance and operations property school tax and replace it with a consumption tax or other mechanism, etc. And finally, religious freedom and privacy. Pass legislation prohibiting the violation of the rights and freedoms of individuals, organizations, and businesses to exercise their sincerely held religious beliefs. Frankly, what I would say from knocking on doors in HD 47, I would think locally within HD 47, the traffic congestion is probably the biggest issue. It's now reached what I would call a dangerous level. I talked to some of the people in Steiner Ranch who had their homes burned down by the wildfire that came into Steiner Ranch, and how this really affected the neighborhood because you can't get out of the neighborhood in the morning to get to work. So when an emergency strikes and there's a fire blazing, it becomes not just annoying but dangerous and frightening. So I really think for HD 47, the issue of traffic congestion is probably the thing I would go after the most, and I'm owing to my systems engineering background, looking at traffic congestion and the policy problems we have as a complex systems engineering problem, because it is. We have a funding problem. We have a problem with Austin city government that has an agenda of new urbanism. They want to weaponize traffic congestion to push everybody downtown into high-rise dwellings. Their vision is to have a very, very dense inner city and to put a multi-billion-dollar Portland-style rail around the city. Well, people in Manhattan really like this lifestyle, right? It works for some people. It doesn't work for HD 47. These people have made a choice to live outside the city. They don't want to be in a dense area. They don't want to be stacked on top of each other. And I think they deserve to have some traffic congestion relief. We should have had a Western Travis County freeway decades ago. Other cities are on their second or third loops. It's ridiculous that Austin still doesn't have one loop around the city. It's inexcusable. And I witnessed, as an Austin council member, because I was on the transportation committee, they call it the mobility committee, but I witnessed the environmental officer cooperating with the Save Our Springs activists, environmental activists that are anti-growth and want to ban all roads. And I think this is really kind of outrageous for taxpayers to be forced to pay taxes, to have that money to go to a bureaucracy that collaborates with extreme environmental groups to shut down road projects, okay? So this illustrates part of the problem we have, and that's going to be my first priority, is solving the traffic congestion.
Well, I love listening to my compatriots here. Don has excellent experience on city council. Aaron has great experience that he talks about all the time at UT Law, on Law Review. Justin has amazing, honorable experience as a police officer, and Jennifer has been out in Lake Country for a few years now. So I am grateful for their perspectives. I agree with much of what they said, but for me, I'm going to answer your question in 2 words: property taxes. I think property taxes are key and crucial because it hits families where we hurt the most. If you can't have a homestead where you can raise your kids, or I talked to several people this past weekend in Lago Vista who specifically moved out there so that they could have a place to bring their grandkids to, and they can't afford it. I talked to one business owner, a female small business owner, who literally paid for her business and her land and is now having to take a loan out to pay for taxes. That's a problem that we need to address. It's a complex problem, just like transportation is. It's not an easy fix. It needs to start with spending restraint. I am a fiscal conservative. And so the next thing I want to talk about is, what does it mean to be a conservative? Because this relates to what I think the biggest priority is for HD 47. I grew up in a Republican Party that believed that being a conservative meant letting people have freedom to make choices for how they're going to live their own lives. I see something happening in our party today that I have great concern about, which is some members of our party are trying to tell people, all people, whether they're in the party or out of the party, how to live, what they should believe, how they should raise their kids. And I think that's a problem, and I think it's anti-Republican. So for me, a very, very big priority is to keep government in its lane. Government has to stay small. We can't have one-size-fits-all big government policies like bans on San Francisco. I don't even know what that means or how we would define that. We can't have that because we need government restrained so that charities and families and businesses, like our chamber's trying to do here, can stand up and help solve very complex problems like homelessness.
So you get the next question, and some of you touched on this already. But why don't you talk about the single most important district issue as you see it in your district? And if you could just keep the answers brief to like 1 to 2 minutes so we can get some more questions in.
Sure,
Kind
I'll
of
make
the
it
hot
really...
topics. When you guys are going around the district, what are you hearing?
Absolutely, I'll tell you.
Things on top of the mind.
So I'll tell you what I hear from people who are politically plugged in. I hear them talking about homelessness. People who live closer to Central Austin, I hear them talking about homelessness. I don't hear true HD 47 voters talking about that. Some of my compatriots might, but I don't. I hear them talking about transportation, property taxes. Every single time I open the door and I ask, what is your issue? I'm here to represent you. I also do not hear them talking about sex ed curriculum. And the last thing I'll say in my 1 to 2 minutes is that it's vital that we elect a representative who is not a single issue candidate. Being at the legislature is incredibly complex, and it's not the same thing as being at a city council. I've been at the legislature. I've been there in the committee meetings. I've actually gotten bills passed on Congress. So it is a complex process that takes a certain kind of person, and we need someone who has depth and breadth of experience.
One of the things I was able to affect in a significant way as a council member is I worked with State Senator Donna Campbell to finally get some legislation passed that would take away Austin's power to annex people's property against their will. It's a huge, huge issue. There's still a lot of deep-seated anger in the suburbs of Austin, like in Anderson Mill, of people who deliberately left the city. They don't agree with the city's politics. They don't like the taxes. They want to get away. They move away. Decades later, Austin comes out and annexes them against their will. And I've talked to some people that are in their 80s and they're still angry. This is real stuff. So I've worked mostly in my door knocking in the northwest part. That kind of makes sense close to where I live. So a lot of people know me and they are more acquainted with the Austin issues. And yes, homelessness is a big issue there. It becomes less of an issue, of course, when you get out into the suburbs. But I'm starting to hear something about the zoning that's been new. People are upset about the zoning. They're concerned that their neighborhoods are going to be torn down and redeveloped. I'm hearing a traffic congestion is always at top of mind. I think it is, for the people I've talked to so far, it is the most important issue. And of course, the property taxes. People are being taxed out of their homes. There are a lot of problems. You can't make everything your top priority. So in my view, I've learned from 30 years of system engineering work, focus on one thing and you have a good chance of getting it solved. If you try to solve everything, there's a fair chance you won't get anything solved.
Yeah, so this is, geographically, you could look at a map, and this is a very diverse district. It's got a lot of smaller communities within it. It's cut in half by Lake Travis, which I know campaigning, it makes it particularly difficult because you can't just go right to left, you got to go. Anyway, but the point is that depending on the neighborhood you're in, everybody's got really a different issue. I mean, yes, of course, you hear a lot about property taxes. This is one of the most property wealthy districts in the state, and yet Vickie Goodwin voted against property tax reform. I mean, if that doesn't put somebody out of step with the district, I don't know what else does. But I hear a lot about that. I do hear a lot about the homeless issue. And the concerns about the homeless issues manifest themselves differently. Yes, we don't deal with downtown homeless issues, but we do deal with stoplight and underpass panhandling issues, right? And obscenity issues from what the homeless folks are holding up on signs. So, I hear a lot about the homeless issue. I hear, of course, a lot about traffic and road safety, which is why I'm big on reforming the Texas Transportation Code, decentralizing and yet holding accountable TxDOT to the Austin area engineer. I hear a lot from folks about the pro-life issue. They feel like not enough pro-life legislation is getting passed on the timeline that it ought to get passed. When you're down in the sort of very southern, sort of 15% of the district, you hear a lot about the AISD sex ed curriculum, like Jennifer was talking about. Elsewhere, I mean, we're mainly Lake Travis ISD and Leander ISD, but when you get down to that smaller part, you hear a lot about AISD sex ed, which is why my solution to the AISD sex ed is in part a robust school choice program so that you can pick up your kid as soon as AISD crosses the line. You pick them up and you move them to where you think you ought to send them. So there's not one issue that you hear about in this district. This is a geographically, economically diverse district that covers all kinds of issues. So that's how I'll answer that.
Okay.
So, like my other opponents here, I don't ever hear just one issue. I think one of the biggest, a lot of it is circumstantial where you live in the district. The Steiner Ranch community, anyone that lives off 620, their feelings is traffic congestion. If you look at a map of Travis County, look at our roadway systems, you do not see any true east-west corridors. You don't see any of them. You have I-35 north and south, MOPAC north and south, 130 north and south, 183 trying to figure out if it's north or south or east or west. It just does weird things. And so we don't have anything. But if you think about how you drive around in our community, you have to go north and south to eventually get to an east and west roadway system where you're met by a traffic light every other block or intersection. So we need to look at finding ways to be more efficient with our roadway systems, and part of that is going to have to be building east-west roadways around our county, especially out in District 47 that attach to 620, because I believe that will alleviate some of the traffic flow problems on 2022, 71 and 290, and elsewhere. Also, what we have is there is a big concern for the homelessness issue in our district. Anyone that's watching the county commissioner race with Gerald Daugherty no longer running knows that Ann Howard's running. Ann Howard is the founder and director of ECHO, Ending Chronic Homelessness. What have we constantly heard about the homeless debate in the Austin area? displace the homeless shelters throughout other parts of our city. Well, you're also going to have to look at displacing homeless shelters in other parts of our county. Recently, there was a hotel that popped up on the City of Austin's list. I think it was by accident, as they came to find out. I think they thought it was theirs, but it's actually Bee Cave property. About putting a homeless shelter out there, and that is smack dab in the middle of District 47 between Bee Cave and Lakeway. And there's concerns for that. And why is there concern? We live in a very wooded area. Come drought time in the summertime, you have a homeless camp set up in the wood lines, and they knock over their propane tank at night, and they cause a fire. We know how fast that can go. Steiner Ranch is still without an evacuation route. You know, that's an issue that we need to look at funding efficiently and get done through. I talked to some people that are involved in the road building process, and I asked them, I go, what do y'all need to complete these roadway projects on time? Do you need incentives? Like, what do you need? And he goes, we need the state to release the money sooner. That's ultimately where it's coming down to. The state's not releasing the money to go through all this red tape. Well, that's a problem, especially when you live in an area where you only have one way in and one way out. That's a big concern. So there are multiple issues in our district, and I think the biggest ones, like I said, is the homeless issue, dealing with the sprawl that's taking place, because as we become a beacon for homelessness in Austin, there is overflow and sprawl that happens for it. And also looking at those that are running for offices out in District 47 area that are probably going to want to bring homeless shelters within our community in District 47 is a big concern for us. And then we got to improve this roadway stuff and really work on how do we realistically and effectively reduce traffic congestion, and that's going to have to be building more efficient roadway systems.
So like everybody said, I think there's not really consensus on what issue is most important in our district. I get a lot of different responses, all of which have been mentioned. However, I have knocked personally almost 3,000 doors. But to be fair, the doors that I'm knocking are Republican primary voters. So these are voters that are very familiar with the legislative priorities of the Republican Party and what's going on at the Texas Legislature, which is not your typical resident of HD 47, unfortunately. And so I would say what's the biggest concern that I am hearing is that their voice is not being heard. They don't feel represented in the House or the Senate, because we don't have enough conservatives that are voting for what they care about. And so that's what I hear the most. They don't feel heard, they don't feel represented, and they don't feel like the legislative priorities that they have chosen through precinct conventions, county conventions, state convention, the legislative priorities that they have chosen are not being pressed forward. That's what.
Just by their representative, or are you saying the Texas legislature
Overall, as a whole?
So can I jump in and ask about property taxes? Nobody likes them. Unfortunately, we got to pay for stuff. So, and almost all of you, I think, have mentioned property taxes at some point. So, obviously, as succinctly as you can, like what would you replace it with? Would you do more of what the legislature did last time, restraining cities and other entities for how much they can raise rates? Do you have plans to actually cut property taxes? What would you as a legislator do about property taxes?
So many problems. The state has good intentions and it passes unfunded mandates that are then placed on the counties to then try to figure out how to pay for. So I would shift those back to the state. Those are state responsibilities, and therefore counties and cities don't have to increase property taxes if some of those burdens aren't just placed on them. So that's one thing I would look at. Also, our state has a bad habit of borrowing from property tax collection for state operating budget. And so then they look like we have, it appears that we have a shortfall in the budget when really the monies are being used in different places. So before, when I was talking about transparency in the budget and how those monies are being spent and what is the state borrowing and what are they borrowing for and why are they doing that and why are they allowed to do that? Also, we have to, in order to cut property taxes, we have to cut expenses. And so as long as we came into this last session with a surplus, and instead of cutting, we added to our budget and in an extraordinary way. And so I'm actually not for full day funded, public funded pre-K. That was a huge increase in our budget. We can't lower property taxes if we keep increasing our spending. And also, SB 10 and 11, those were mental health bills that added $2.5 million annually to our education budget. I'm not for those bills. So the way that I would decrease property taxes is I would cut spending, stop the spending, overspending. I would force transparency, and I would stop the unfunded mandates.
So when I look at property taxes and property tax reform, I look at it in a different way. I look at it as we need to be efficient with the use of our tax dollars. And what that mean by that is, I look to the preamble of the Constitution. What is the role of government? It says, provide for the general welfare and promote the common defense. That's what I look at. Well, the general welfare isn't niche welfare. It's not item specific that only handles a small group of people. It's for everybody, like our roadway systems. We'll make sure we have fresh drinking water we can drink from because we're investing in those infrastructures so we're not getting turbid water coming out. Looking at things like that and funding those systems first. So I'm a big believer, let's set up our priorities. What do we need versus what do we want? So as legislative appropriation requests come in from the variety of different departments around the state when they put their budget requests in the off year, let's look at that and let's look at what is a need and what is a want and set them out separately. Then we go by those needs and focus on making sure we get those needs funded that focus on the general populace of Texas. And then from that we can debate our wants. And so for me, I look at doing things, and I'm actually a big supporter of what the legislation did this last session with regards to the vote trigger. It allows the constituent to have more of a say in how they want to spend their money. However, I think there was an unintended consequence with that, is we need to now look at our appraisal boards. Having appraisal boards coming in on the back end and inflating your valuation of your home so it can increase the taxation amount that they're getting, we need to look at sealing that off. I don't think that was intentionally left open for that to be there. I think everyone thought you would be moral and ethical on the true value of your home, rather than artificially inflating it as a backdoor way to grab people's money. So I focus more on, when it comes to property taxes, is focus on our needs and ensure those are addressed, and then we can debate our wants after that. Because if we're efficient with the use of our tax dollars, we can keep our taxes low and actually, in the course of it, lower property taxes altogether. Because when we're spending on what we need, rather than trying to fund all the things we want, we can actually keep our property taxes low.
So first, I just want to express a bit of alarm to hear from Jennifer, the textbook liberal talking point that ascribes blame to the Republican state for unfunded mandates. This is literally what local liberals have been complaining about for decades, blaming the state for all these so-called unfunded mandates. I find that surprising, and I don't know if that necessarily aligns with the facts. So I would say that in 2019, I'm happy, although not completely, with property tax reform. I'm happy with the idea that if political subdivisions are going to increase taxes, that they ought to face approval from the voters beyond a certain threshold. But I don't think that necessarily went far enough, because reform is not necessarily relief. So how do we get relief? Well, moving forward, I'd like to see a few things. Number one, I agree with Jennifer and I agree with Justin that we have a massive spending problem. I think that there is so much fat to cut. We don't have enough time. We'll have to do another podcast or interview to talk about all the areas in which I'd like to see cut in state spending. Second, I think that we ought to pass a conservative Texas budget. And without going into the details about zero-based budgeting and program-based budgeting, I would encourage you to just consider what the Texas Public Policy Foundation has written for several years on a conservative Texas budget, and know that I am in favor of that. Third, as is consistent with something that I've said before, I'd like to see political subdivisions reined in. I think too often state-level Republicans just sort of shake their fists at cities and counties without remembering that cities and counties are creatures of the state. They exist because the state created them and chartered them, and the state is therefore free to rein them in if it deems necessary for the welfare of the state. And finally, I'd like to see a tremendous increase in mandatory fiscal audits and transparency across the board. Moving forward, long-term, what is the vision? The vision is to transition to a consumption-based tax system as opposed to a property tax system. And this fundamentally gets to issues of justice and fairness. I believe that it is fundamentally unjust and unfair that you have to pay for life rent to the government. That is fundamentally what property taxes are. Whereas with a consumption-based system, you opt in to economic activity or you opt out. You choose the level of taxation that you will bear or you choose not. So without going into any particular policy prescriptions, I don't think that we're going to get to a consumption system in 2021, but that's the motivating vision behind what I'd like to see.
But it would be very interesting, since you brought it up, is what are the areas that you say that we should be taxing? Because basically you're going to have to raise the taxes somewhere to get it balanced out. So where do you say you raise taxes?
Well, look, I think you start with the real problem, which is the spending problem. I think it is a false assumption, and this is where you get to sort of zero-based budgeting, right? Zero-based budgeting is this idea that you start every new legislative session starting at zero, and then, like Justin said, being careful, using good statesmanship and negotiations to figure out what are we going to spend money on. The underlying assumption in legislative budgeting today is that you just, by default, start with the spending from last time and then see where you can increase.
Is there one or two big areas that you say, a lot of fat, let's cut there?
I think that the administrative state, the fourth state, I think that unfortunately our administrative bureaucracies are far out of control. I think that there's a lot of areas to cut there. So I think that there's probably 10 areas to cut in there. So I would say that our administrative state has the most abundance of fat to cut.
Well, it's great running with a bunch of competent Republicans like these. I'm just going to say ditto to all these comments. They're very well stated. Let me say quickly, again, when I was on council, I was able to get some tours of the charter schools over in East Austin. It is remarkable, the growth in charter school enrollment. And I got a chance to speak with people running the schools, some of the students and parents that go there. People love choices. Today in the Austin area, if you're sufficiently wealthy, you can choose any school you want. Or you can homeschool, you can go to an expensive elite private school. Wealthy people have choices in education. I argue that all Texans deserve choices in education. So it starts with more choice. I agree with Peggy Venable, who I worked with years ago, who battled this for years. And she would always say, we need more education for the dollars that we pay. Not constantly more education, more dollars for education. The current political system is incessantly demanding more money, more money, more money. It's like a bad Jeopardy game where the government schools answer to every question, more taxes, more money, more debt. What was your question? That game has got to stop, and we can stop it with school choice. What does that school choice look like? Well, that's why we should have honest debates in the legislature, because as my colleagues understand, school finance is very complicated now. The budget issues are complicated. The education code is very unwieldy. So yes, it is complicated to solve, but I think the solution lies in school choice, that we can get better education for less dollars. Finally, on the property tax question, I've given a lot of thought to the idea of having the chief appraiser stand for election. Right now you have the assessor-collector standing for election to the voters. Well, that's good to have them accountable, but the assessor-collector is largely the bean counter that takes the tax rates that are established by the taxing entities, applies it to a value and sends out the bill and does this administration. Of course, that's a big, important job, but the more political job is the chief appraiser, because the chief appraiser has responsibility for interpreting many, many lines of code. When I was on council, there was a lawsuit that came out under the direction of Mayor Adler asking some questions about, hey, chief appraiser, how are you interpreting certain sections of the tax code? And we did not get an answer. And one of the reasons I supported that lawsuit is I wanted a district judge to tell the chief appraiser to share information with us with how she was interpreting the tax code. So again, I would argue that the chief appraiser needs to answer to the people paying the taxes, not just the people profiting from the taxes.
I'm from Florida, haven't been here long enough. Who's the appraiser report to?
Well, there's a board that names, but basically the taxing entities, the city, the county, the school, the taxing entities are in control of the board, and the board is naming chief appraiser. Okay, they don't stand before voters. To me, there's a conflict of interest that the people who profit or making profits out of rising appraisals are picking the people that interpret the appraisal rules.
So they don't they're not part of the tax assessor's structure. It's a separate structure.
No, but again, the important point is the chief appraiser does not stand for election.
The appraiser decides the value. The tax assessor collects the taxes based on that value, right? So I'm going to basically agree with a lot of what they've said in the interest of time because we're here at the end of our time together, I believe. I'm going to differentiate a couple of things. First of all, I disagree with the platform and some of the people on this panel who think we should move to a consumption tax. I think that is a serious, serious problem. You're looking at tacking on, I looked at the numbers a while ago, I'm going to kind of mess it up based on old budgets, but if you look at how many Texans we have here and how much we raise in sales tax versus property tax right now, you're looking at least $4,000 per person. So there are 4 people in my family, that's $16,000 that I'm going to have to pay because I need to go buy shoes and I need to go buy groceries and I need to buy a car. And the other part of property tax, of course, is that it's not just residences that are taxed, it's also businesses and manufacturing sector and of course our all-important oil and gas sector. So this is a complex issue. The other thing that I would say is I absolutely agree with Jennifer in this. We need transparency and we need accountability. There are people on the floor of the House, of the Texas Legislature, who have no idea how the budgeting process works because it is so complex. I mean, I've been in and around the Capitol for over 2 decades and I'm still learning all of the ins and outs of the budgeting process. So we have to have a simple process, a transparent process. This is what we have, this is what we can spend, and I also agree with Justin, wants versus needs. I think that's a really good metric. So there you go.